Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Sarah certainly did. For 10 years, she served the Blackwood family like a maid, ignored by her husband and mocked by high society. But at her father-in-law's 75th Jubilee, the humiliation went too far. When her husband's mistress walked in and tried to kick Sarah out of the family mansion, everyone expected Sarah to crumble. They didn't expect the family patriarch to step in. And they definitely didn't expect the piece of paper he was holding, a document that proved the person getting kicked out wasn't Sarah. Stay tuned, because you won't believe who actually owns the Blackwood estate. The morning of the Jubilee broke with a grey, oppressive humidity that clung to the windows of the Blackwood Manor. It was a sprawling Georgian estate in the heart of Connecticut, the kind of house that had terrified Sarah 10 years ago, and truth be told, still terrified her today. But not because of its size. It was the people inside it. Sarah stood in the center of the grand hall, a clipboard pressed against her chest. She was 34, though the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her shoulders made her look older. She wore a simple grey cardigan and slacks, blending into the muted tones of the wallpaper. This was by design. Her husband, Richard, preferred her to blend in. "The orchids," a sharp voice echoed from the staircase. "I specifically asked for the white phalaenopsis, Sarah. Why am I looking at lilies?" Sarah flinched, turning to see Richard descending the marble stairs. At 40, Richard Blackwood was undeniable handsome, tall, with the sort of jawline that suggested money and a cruelty that suggested he knew how to keep it. He was adjusting the cuffs of a bespoke navy suit, not bothering to look her in the eye. "The florist called, Richard," Sarah said, her voice steady but quiet. "There was a supply issue with the importer. The lilies are the Casablanca variety. Arthur loves them. They were his late wife's favorite." Richard stopped on the final step. He finally looked at her, his blue eyes cold and dismissive. "I didn't ask what my father loves. I asked what I ordered. This is the 75th Jubilee. The press will be here. The board of directors will be here. Do you have any idea how much relies on the optics of tonight? It's a birthday party, Richard." "Not a merger," Sarah replied, a rare spark of defiance lighting her chest. Richard laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He closed the distance between them, towering over her. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of her brown hair behind her ear, a gesture that should have been affectionate, but felt possessive and demeaning. "Everything is a merger, Sarah. That is why you are still struggling. You think small, you think about sentiment. I think about legacy." He dropped his hand and checked his Rolex. "Is the catering staff prepped? I don't want a repeat of Christmas." "They are setting up in the West Wing. Everything is on schedule." "Good." He walked past her toward the front door. "I'm going into the city to pick up a distinct gift for Father. I'll be back an hour before the guests arrive. Do try to look presentable tonight. Wear that navy thing I bought you 3 years ago. It covers you up well enough." "Richard," she called out before he reached the heavy oak door. "Your father asked if you'd have breakfast with him. He's in the solarium." Richard didn't even turn around. "Tell him I'm busy. I'm securing his future. He can eat his toast alone." The door slammed, the sound reverberating through the empty hall. Sarah let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since she woke up. She walked over to the window, watching Richard's Porsche 911 tear down the gravel driveway. He wasn't going to buy a gift. She knew that. The gift had been sitting in his office, safe for a week. A vintage Patek Philippe watch. She knew because she had ordered it, wrapped it, and written the card. He was going to see her. Sarah wasn't stupid. She had known about the affair for 6 months. The late nights, the smell of Santal 33 perfume on his shirts, a scent Sarah never wore, and the credit card charges at hotels in Manhattan. She knew her name was Tiffany Miller, Richard's executive consultant. 26 years old, ambitious, and stunningly beautiful in a way that made Sarah feel like a piece of worn-out furniture. Sarah turned away from the window and walked toward the back of the house, toward the solarium. The house was buzzing with hired staff, polishing silver and arranging tables. But Sarah felt entirely alone. She entered the solarium, a glass-walled room filled with tropical plants and the smell of damp earth. In the center, sitting in a wheelchair with a blanket over his knees, was Arthur Blackwood. Arthur was a lion of a man, even at 75 and battling the aftermath of a stroke. His hair was snow white, his face lined with decades of hard decisions, but his eyes were sharp. He was staring out at the rose garden. "He left," Arthur rasped, not turning his head. Sarah walked over and poured him a cup of tea from the silver service on the table. "He had to go into the city, Arthur. Urgent business for the firm. He sends his apologies." Arthur scoffed, reaching for the cup with a trembling hand. "He sends his lies. The boy hasn't had an urgent business meeting on a Saturday in his life, unless it involved a skirt or a scotch." Sarah didn't answer. She sat opposite him, peeling an orange with practiced efficiency. She and Arthur had a strange, quiet alliance. When she had first married Richard, a girl from a middle-class family in Ohio with a nursing degree, the Blackwood social circle had eaten her alive. They called her a gold digger. But Arthur? Arthur had watched her. He saw how she cared for Richard when he had the flu, how she managed the household accounts to save money even though they were rich. And later, how she became Arthur's primary caregiver when the nurses annoyed him. "You look tired, Sarah," Arthur said, watching her hands. "Just prep, Arthur. Big night." "He treats you like an employee," Arthur grumbled. "Worse than an employee. I pay the employees." Sarah offered him a slice of orange. "He's stressed. He wants tonight to be perfect for you." Arthur took the orange but didn't eat it immediately. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He wants tonight to be perfect for him. He thinks I'm going to announce his full succession tonight. He thinks I'm handing over the chairmanship and the deed to the estate." Sarah froze. That was exactly what Richard thought. It was all he had talked about for months. "Once the old man signs over the house, we can finally renovate this mausoleum," he had said. "Are you?" Sarah asked softly. Arthur smiled, a mischievous glint in his eye that reminded Sarah of why he had been such a terrifying businessman in his prime. "I'm going to announce the truth. The lawyers will be here at 8. Arthur, what are you planning?" He patted her hand. His skin was paper-thin and cold. "Justice, my dear. And perhaps a little bit of theatre. You've been the only real thing in this house for 10 years, Sarah. Tonight, I want you to remember that. No matter what Richard says, no matter who he brings, you hold your head up. Do you promise me?" "Who he brings?" Sarah asked, a knot forming in her stomach. "Who would he bring?" Arthur looked away, his expression darkening. "I have ears, Sarah. I may be stuck in this chair, but I am not deaf. I heard him on the phone yesterday. He's invited Ms. Miller." The air left the room. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "He wouldn't? Not here. Not tonight. It's a family event." "He's arrogant," Arthur said, crushing the orange slice in his hand. "He thinks he's untouchable because he thinks I'm senile and you're weak. He is wrong on both counts." Sarah stood up, her hands shaking. I need to check on the linens." "Sarah," Arthur commanded. She stopped. "Wear the red dress." She looked back at him. What? The red dress. The one you bought for the opera gala last year that he told you was too loud, so you never wore it. Wear it. I can't, Arthur. Richard told me to wear the navy. I am the patriarch of this family, and it is my birthday. Arthur slammed his hand on the armrest. If you respect me, you will wear the damn red dress. You are the lady of this house, not his shadow. Start dressing like it. Sarah looked at the old man, seeing the fierce protection in his eyes. For the first time all day, her shoulders dropped. Okay, she whispered. I'll wear the red dress. By 7 p.m., the driveway of the Blackwood estate looked like a luxury car dealership. Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and Aston Martins lined the gravel loop. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the murmur of the East Coast elite. The grand hall was transformed. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above towering arrangements of white lilies. Richard hadn't noticed they weren't orchids, of course. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters in white gloves moved like ghosts through the crowd, offering champagne and caviar. Sarah stood at the top of the staircase. She felt exposed. She was wearing the red dress. It was a floor-length silk gown, structured and elegant, with a neckline that was tasteful, yet daring. It fit her perfectly. She had styled her hair up, revealing her neck, and wore a pair of diamond drop earrings that had belonged to her own grandmother. Not expensive, but sentimental. She took a deep breath and descended. Heads turned. At first, just a few. Then, ripples of silence spread through the room. People who usually looked right through Sarah, the bankers' wives, the country club presidents, stopped talking and stared. They weren't used to seeing Sarah Blackwood look powerful. Richard was at the bottom of the stairs, his back to her, holding court with a group of investors. He was laughing, a drink in hand. And that's why the market is shifting toward... Richard stopped as he saw the investors looking past him, their eyes widening. Richard turned around. When he saw Sarah, his smile vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped forward to intercept her before she could reach the guests. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, grabbing her elbow, his grip tight enough to bruise. "I told you to wear the navy suit. You look like a showgirl." "I look like your wife," Sarah said, pulling her arm away. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but Arthur's words echoed in her mind. "You are the lady of this house." "And Arthur asked me to wear this." "Arthur is losing his mind," Richard spat. "Go upstairs and change, now, before you embarrass me further." "No," she said. Richard blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" "I said no. The guests are here. I am the hostess. I'm not going to leave them to go play dress-up because you're insecure." Before Richard could respond, the heavy front doors swung open again. The chatter in the room didn't just quiet down. It stopped. Framed in the doorway was a woman who clearly intended to suck every ounce of oxygen out of the room. She was young, blonde, and devastatingly pretty. But it wasn't just her beauty that caused the silence. It was her dress. Tiffany Miller was wearing a white, beaded gown that looked suspiciously like a wedding dress. It was backless, tight, and trailed a 3-foot train behind her. It was a statement. It was a declaration of war. She stepped into the hall, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Richard. She smiled, a predatory, victorious smile. Richard's anger at Sarah evaporated, replaced by a flustered, sweaty panic that quickly morphed into a greasy charm. He abandoned Sarah and walked toward Tiffany. "Tiffany," Richard announced, his voice booming a little too loudly. "So glad you could make it. Everyone, this is Tiffany Miller, the brilliant consultant who helped us close the Tokyo deal." the room murmured. Everyone knew. In circles like this, secrets were currency, and everyone was rich. They knew exactly who she was. Tiffany didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Sarah. She glided across the floor, Richard trailing her like a puppy. She stopped in front of Sarah, looking her up and down. The contrast was striking. Sarah in regal, bold red. Tiffany in flashy, inappropriate white. "Sarah," Tiffany said, her voice sugary sweet, but loud enough for the nearby circle to hear. "Richard talks about you so much. He said you were homely. But that dress is certainly trying hard, isn't it?" Sarah stiffened. "Miss Miller, you're late. And you're wearing white to a birthday party. I assume you mistook the invitation for a bridal expo?" A few guests stifled chuckles. Tiffany's smile faltered for a microsecond before hardening. "Oh, honey," Tiffany laughed, stepping closer and handing her sequined clutch bag to Sarah. "Here, be a dear, and have someone put this in the coat check. And fetch me a vodka martini, extra dry. I've had a long drive." She treated her like the help. In front of 50 of the most influential people in Connecticut, she had handed the wife her bag and ordered a drink. Richard stood there, watching. This was the moment. This was the moment a husband would step in, correct the mistake, and defend his wife's honor. Richard laughed. "Go on, Sarah," Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. "Take her bag, and make sure the bar knows Tiffany is VIP tonight. Whatever she wants, she gets." The humiliation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The heat rose in her cheeks. She looked at Richard, silently begging him to stop, to realize what he was doing. But he was looking at Tiffany with a hunger that made Sarah's stomach turn. Sarah held the clutch bag. It felt heavy, like a brick. She looked around the room. The guests were pretending to look away, but they were watching, judging, pitying. "I am not the coat check girl," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. She held the bag out, waiting for Tiffany to take it back. Tiffany didn't move her hands. She just smirked. "Well, you're certainly not the wife of the year, are you? Just take the bag, Sarah. Don't make a scene. It's Arthur's big night." "Yes," Richard snapped. "Sarah, stop being difficult. Take the bag." "I'll take it." A deep, booming voice resonated from the corridor. The crowd parted. Arthur Blackwood was being wheeled into the room by his nurse. He looked majestic in his tuxedo, despite the wheelchair. His face was like granite. He rolled up to the trio. He looked at Richard with disdain, then at Tiffany with cold amusement, and finally at Sarah with pride. "I'll take the bag," Arthur repeated. He reached out, snatched the sequined clutch from Sarah's hand, and without breaking eye contact with Tiffany, dropped it onto the floor. Thump. "Oops," Arthur deadpanned. "My grip isn't what it used to be." Tiffany's jaw dropped. "That's a Prada." "I don't care if it's the Holy Grail," Arthur interrupted. "You are in my house, young woman. And in my house, you do not mistake the lady of the manor for a servant. If you want a drink, the bar is over there. If you want to hang your coat, the closet is by the door. If you want to insult my daughter-in-law, the exit is behind you." The silence in the room was absolute. Richard stepped forward, his face red. "Father, that is uncalled for. Tiffany is a guest. She's important to the company." "Is she?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "We'll see how important she is when the lawyers arrive. Now get out of my way, Richard. I want to dance with my date." Arthur held out a hand to Sarah. "Sarah, would you do an old man the honor of wheeling him to the center of the room?" Sarah looked at Richard's furious face, then at Tiffany's shocked expression. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile. She stepped over the Prada bag on the floor. "I would love to, Arthur," she said. She took the handles of the wheelchair and guided him into the crowd, leaving Richard and his mistress standing alone in the foyer, the whispers of the guests rising around them like a tide. But Sarah knew this wasn't the end. She saw the look in Tiffany's eyes as they walked away. It was the look of someone who wasn't used to losing. And Richard? Richard looked like a man who was about to do something desperate. The night had only just begun. The transition from the grand hall to the dining room was a procession of uneasy silence. The air in the house had changed. What was supposed to be a celebration of Arthur Blackwood's life had curdled into a battleground, and the guests, sharks in expensive suits, smelled blood in the water. The dining room was a cavernous space, panelled in dark mahogany that seemed to absorb the candlelight. A table for 20 had been set with the family's finest china, the royal Dalton service that was only used for weddings and funerals. Sarah felt a grim irony in that. She walked behind Arthur's wheelchair, her head held high, though her legs felt like lead. As they approached the table, Sarah stopped her. Her breath hitched in her throat. At the head of the table sat Arthur. To his right, the seat of honor, was Richard. And to Richard's right, in the seat that had been Sarah's for the last 10 years, sat Tiffany. The name card reading Mrs. Sarah Blackwood had been removed. In its place was a freshly handwritten card, Ms. Tiffany Miller. Sarah stood frozen, her hand gripping the back of Arthur's wheelchair. Richard was already seated, pouring a glass of wine for Tiffany, who was whispering something in his ear that made him chuckle. She looked up as Sarah approached, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "Oh," Tiffany said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Richard, darling, I think there's been a mix-up. I seem to be in Sarah's seat." She didn't move a muscle to get up. Richard didn't even look up from his wine. "It's not a mix-up. I adjusted the seating chart. We need to discuss the Tokyo expansion during dinner, and since you're the lead consultant, it makes sense for you to be close." He pointed a lazy finger toward the far end of the table, near the swinging kitchen doors. "Sarah, there's a spot for you down there, next to cousin Beatrice." Beatrice was Richard's deaf, 90-year-old great-aunt. It was the children's table, equivalent for adults. It was a calculated public banishment. The guests were watching. They were pretending to check their phones or adjust their napkins, but every ear was tuned to the head of the table. Arthur shifted in his chair. He opened his mouth to roar, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She squeezed it, a silent signal. Not yet. If she fought for a chair now, she would look petty. She would look like the hysterical wife fighting for scraps. "It's quite all right," Sarah said, her voice steady, though it lacked warmth. "The view is better from the other end. You can see the whole room, and everyone in it." She walked the length of the long table, the silk of her red dress rustling softly against the floor. Every step was a lesson in dignity. She sat next to Aunt Beatrice, who smiled toothlessly and patted her hand. Sarah unfolded her napkin, looked down the expanse of the table, and locked eyes with Richard. For a second, he looked unsettled by her compliance. He wanted a fight. He wanted her to scream so he could call her crazy. Her silence was a weapon he didn't know how to parry. The first course was served, a lobster bisque, the room filled with the soft clatter of silver spoons against porcelain. Richard stood up, tapping his glass with a knife. "If I could have everyone's attention," Richard announced, putting on his best boardroom smile. "I know we are here to celebrate my father, Arthur, a giant of industry." He raised his glass to Arthur, who stared back at him with eyes like flint. Arthur didn't raise his glass, but, Richard continued, undeterred, "I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the future. The Blackwood legacy isn't just about the past. It's about evolution. It's about vitality. He placed a hand on Tiffany's bare shoulder. She preened under his touch. Tiffany here has been instrumental in revitalizing our vision. She represents the new energy we need. To Arthur, and to the future. To the future, the guests mumbled, drinking awkwardly. Tiffany remained seated, but she turned her head to address the table, her voice dropping to a theatrical, confidential tone that was meant to be heard by everyone. "Thank you, Richard," she cooed. "It's easy to have vision when you're building a legacy for the next generation." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then she looked directly down the table at Sarah. "Speaking of which," Tiffany said, feigning innocence. "Sarah, Richard was telling me you've been turning the guest room into a sewing room. That's so quaint. I suppose since the nursery has been empty for 10 years, you had to find a use for it eventually." The silence that followed was deafening. It was a cruelty so specific, so deep, that even the jaded socialites flinched. Sarah and Richard's inability to conceive had been a source of quiet pain for Sarah for a decade, a pain Richard had weaponized in private, and now Tiffany was weaponizing in public. Richard smirked into his wine glass. He didn't defend her. Sarah felt the tears prickling behind her eyes. Her hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to run. She wanted to flip the table. But then she looked at Arthur. The old man was gripping his butter knife so hard his knuckles were white. He was shaking with rage. If she broke, he might have a stroke right there. She had to be the strong one. Sarah picked up her wine glass. She didn't stand up. She didn't raise her voice. She just spoke, clear and cold. "The guest room is actually being converted into a library, Tiffany," Sarah said. "I find that as one gets older, one appreciates substance over clutter. And as for the nursery, well, children require a stable home and a father who is present. We've never had either." A gasp rippled through the room. Someone dropped a fork. Tiffany's smile vanished. Richard slammed his glass down, wine sloshing onto the white tablecloth. "Watch your tone, Sarah," Richard snapped. "I'm just making conversation, darling," Sarah replied, taking a sip of wine. "To the future." She had drawn blood, but she knew the retaliation would be severe. The dinner continued, but the food tasted like ash. Sarah could feel Richard's glare burning into her from across the room. He wasn't just angry now. He was hateful. He was done with her. And frankly, she realized as she looked at him, fawning over his mistress, she was done with him. The dinner dragged on for 2 hours, an agonizing marathon of forced smiles and pointed exclusion. When the dessert, a dark chocolate tart, was finally cleared, Richard stood up immediately. "The lawyers, Mr. Henderson and his associates, have arrived in the library," Richard announced, checking his watch. "Father, it's time to sign the transition papers." Arthur wiped his mouth with his napkin, moving with agonizing slowness. "Is it?" "Yes," Richard said, his patience snapping. "It is. Let's get this over with so we can enjoy the rest of the party." Richard gestured to the nurse to wheel Arthur out. As the group began to move toward the double doors, Richard broke away and marched toward the far end of the table. He grabbed Sarah by the upper arm, pulling her out of her chair and dragging her toward the side exit, away from the guests. "You," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You are finished." "Let go of me, Richard," Sarah said, struggling against his grip. He shoved her into the service hallway, a narrow corridor used by the waitstaff. The noise of the party faded behind the heavy door. "You humiliated me," Richard snarled. "That little comment about the nursery, about me not being present? Do you have any idea who is in that room? My investors, my reputation. Your reputation? Sarah laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Richard, your mistress is wearing a wedding dress at your father's birthday party. You destroyed your reputation. I just pointed it out. Richard stared at her, his eyes cold and dead. You think you're so smart. You think because Arthur likes you, you're safe? Let me tell you what's going to happen in that library right now. He leaned in, whispering the words like a curse. Arthur is signing the estate over to me. Total control. The house, the accounts, the trust. All of it. And the second the ink is dry, I am filing for divorce. You will leave this house tonight, Sarah. You can pack a bag, take your little red dress, and get an Uber. Because you get nothing. The prenup ensures that. Sarah felt a chill run through her bone marrow. She knew the prenup was ironclad. She had signed it when she was 24 and blindly in love. You can't kick me out tonight, she whispered. Where will I go? I don't care, Richard said. Go back to Ohio. Go to a shelter. Just get out of my life. Tiffany is moving in tomorrow. He straightened his jacket, satisfied with the fear he saw in her eyes. Now stay here. If you come into the library, I will have security drag you out. And I'll make sure you don't even get the car. Richard turned and stormed back into the party, heading toward the library to claim his prize. Sarah slumped against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. The fight drained out of her. 10 years. 10 years of nursing his ego, nursing his father, managing his home, tolerating his coldness. And for what? To be discarded like trash in a service hallway. Well, look at you. Sarah looked up. Tiffany was standing at the end of the hallway. She had followed them. The mistress walked over, her heels clicking on the linoleum. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked pitying, which was worse. She reached into her purse and pulled out a compact mirror, checking her lipstick. You really should have left when you had the chance, Sarah, Tiffany said, snapping the compact shut. It's pathetic to watch you hang on. Sarah stood up, dusting off her dress. She wouldn't let this woman see her cry. He'll do it to you too, you know. You're the new energy now. But in 5 years, you'll just be the wife he ignores. Tiffany laughed, a sharp, barking sound. Oh, honey. No, see, that's the difference between you and me. You loved him. I don't. Tiffany took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I don't care if he ignores me. I don't care who he sleeps with. I want the lifestyle. I want the Blackwood name. I want this mansion. And unlike you, I'm smart enough to secure my position. Tiffany placed a hand on her stomach. You asked why I'm here tonight? Why Richard is so desperate to sign the papers now? It's not just the Tokyo deal. Sarah stared at Tiffany's hand. You're pregnant, Tiffany beamed. A son. We found out yesterday. That's why Richard is in such a rush. He needs the estate in his name so he can set up the trust for his real heir. The heir you couldn't give him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A child. Richard was having a child with this woman. That was the final nail. There was no coming back from this. So, Tiffany said, waving a hand toward the back exit. Run along. The adults are doing business. Richard is going to sign the papers. And by midnight, I'll be the mistress of Blackwood Manor. And you'll be nobody. Tiffany turned and sashayed away, heading toward the library to join Richard. Sarah stood alone in the hallway. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound. She felt hollowed out, defeated. She turned toward the back door. Richard was right. She should just leave. Why stay and watch them win? She put her hand on the doorknob. The cool night air seeped through the cracks. If you respect me, you will wear the damn red dress. Arthur's voice echoed in her memory. "I am going to announce the truth." Sarah paused. Arthur knew. Arthur knew everything. He had told her to hold her head up. He had told her he was planning justice. If she left now, she wasn't just abandoning the house. She was abandoning Arthur. She was leaving him alone with the wolves. Sarah took a deep breath. She let go of the back door. She turned around and walked back toward the main hall. She wasn't going to leave. She was going to that library. If they were going to throw her out, they were going to have to look her in the eye when they did it. Sarah pushed open the double doors of the library just as Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer, laid a thick stack of documents on the heavy oak desk. Richard was standing there, a pen in his hand, shaking with adrenaline. Tiffany was by his side, her hand on his arm. Arthur sat in his wheelchair at the head of the desk, looking tired but alert. When Sarah entered, Richard spun around. "I told you to get out!" Richard roared, losing all composure. "I live here, Richard," Sarah said, walking into the room and standing next to Arthur's wheelchair. She placed her hand on the old man's shoulder. "And until Arthur signs those papers, this is still his house, and I am staying with him." Arthur looked up at Sarah. He saw the tears she was holding back, but he also saw the steel in her spine. He reached up and covered her hand with his. "She stays," Arthur said, his voice deep and final. "Fine," Richard spat. "Let her watch. It might be educational. Let her see what happens when you fail to secure your place in this family." Richard slammed the pen down on the desk in front of his father. "Sign it, Dad. Transfer the deed. Transfer the voting rights. Let's end this charade." Arthur looked at the pen. Then he looked at Mr. Henderson, the lawyer. "Mr. Henderson," Arthur said calmly, "are the modifications we discussed prepared?" "Yes, sir," Mr. Henderson said, pulling a separate single blue folder from his briefcase. He didn't look at Richard. He looked uncomfortable. "Modifications?" Richard frowned. "What modifications? We agreed on the standard succession plan." "We agreed on nothing," Arthur said. "You assumed. I observed." Arthur didn't pick up the pen. Instead, he pushed the thick stack of papers, the ones Richard had prepared, off the desk. They scattered across the Persian rug with a chaotic rustle. "I'm not signing those," Arthur said. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice rose to a screech. "You have to sign. The board. The investors." "The estate is mine to give," Arthur said, his voice rising, regaining the power of the tycoon he once was. "And I do not give it to a man who brings his pregnant mistress to my wife's memorial jubilee." Richard froze. Tiffany gasped. "You knew?" Richard whispered. "I know everything," Arthur snapped. "And I know that for 10 years you have neglected the only person in this family who actually gives a damn about anyone other than themselves." Arthur gestured to the blue folder Mr. Henderson was holding. "Read it, Mr. Henderson. Tell my son who owns this house." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and opened the blue folder. The room was silent enough to hear a pin drop. Sarah held her breath, her hand tightening on Arthur's shoulder. "Effective immediately," Mr. Henderson read, his voice dry and professional. "Arthur Blackwood transfers the entirety of the Blackwood estate, including the manor, the grounds, and the controlling interest in the Blackwood Family Trust, to a new sole beneficiary." Richard was smiling, a confused, manic look on his face. "Sole beneficiary? But that's me. I'm the only son." Mr. Henderson looked over his spectacles at Richard. "The beneficiary is not you, Richard." Mr. Henderson turned his eyes toward Sarah. "The sole owner of the Blackwood estate is Mrs. Sarah Blackwood." The silence in the library was suffocating. It pressed against the dark oak bookshelves and the velvet curtains, heavier than the humid air outside. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. Tick, tock, judgment. Day. Richard stared at Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer. His mouth was slightly open, a frozen grimace of disbelief. The words Mrs. Sarah Blackwood hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. Then Richard laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a jagged, fractured noise. He turned to his father, shaking his head. "Okay," Richard said, wiping a hand across his mouth. "Very good. Excellent theatre, Dad. You wanted to scare me straight? Lesson learned. Don't bring the mistress to the party. I get it." He reached out, his hand trembling, to grab the blue folder from the desk. "Now, let's stop the games. Where are the real papers? The investors are waiting." Mr. Henderson placed his hand firmly over the folder before Richard could touch it. The lawyer's face was unreadable, a mask of professional indifference that terrified Richard more than any shout could have. "This is not theatre, Mr. Blackwood," Henderson said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the law. "The deed was notarized 3 days ago. The transfer has been filed with the county clerk. As of 9:00 a.m. this morning, the title of the Blackwood estate and the chairmanship of the family trust resides with Sarah." Richard recoiled as if he had been slapped. He looked at Sarah. She was standing by Arthur's wheelchair, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. She didn't look like a winner. She looked like someone who had just survived a collision. "Her," Richard whispered, pointing a shaking finger at his wife. "You gave my birthright to her. She's a nurse from Ohio, Dad. She's a nobody. She doesn't know how to run an estate." "She knows how to manage a home," Arthur said. His voice was low, rasping from his chest, but it cut through Richard's hysteria. "And she knows the value of loyalty. 2 things you have never learned." Arthur wheeled his chair backward slightly, creating distance between himself and his son. "For 10 years, Richard, I have watched you. I watched you treat this house like a hotel. I watched you treat my money like a limitless credit card, and I watched you treat your wife like a servant." "I treated her like what she is," Richard shouted, veins bulging in his neck. "I gave her a life she couldn't dream of." "You gave her nothing but grief," Arthur roared, slamming his fist on the armrest. The sudden volume made Tiffany jump. She had been standing by the window, clutching her stomach. Sarah could see the gears turning behind Tiffany's eyes. The mistress was doing the math, and the numbers were crashing. Arthur took a ragged breath. "Do you remember last winter, Richard, when the boiler broke in the east wing?" "I don't know, You were in Aspen," Arthur interrupted, "skiing with a blonde whose name you probably don't remember. I was bedridden with pneumonia. The heating went out at 2:00 a.m. Arthur pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. "Do you know what your wife did? She didn't call a hotel. She went down to the basement. She sat by the emergency generator for 6 hours, manually feeding it fuel so that my medical equipment wouldn't fail. She froze in that basement, so I would be warm." Sarah looked down, remembering that night. She hadn't done it for the inheritance. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. "That is when I knew," Arthur said, softness returning to his voice. "This house isn't just bricks and mortar. It's a responsibility. Sarah has been doing the work for a decade. Now, she gets the title." "It's my inheritance," Richard screamed, grabbing a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and hurling it at the wall. It shattered, raining glass onto the carpet. "I am the heir." "You were," Mr. Henderson interjected calmly, "until you violated the morality clause of the original trust, bringing a pregnant mistress to your father's jubilee. Legally speaking, that is a breach of contract." Richard stood panting in the center of the room, He looked at Tiffany. "Tiffany," Richard said, his voice desperate. "Tell them. Tell them about the baby. It's a boy. The next Blackwood heir." Tiffany stepped forward, her confidence replaced by desperation. "Mr. Blackwood, please, I am carrying Richard's child. Surely you wouldn't let your grandson starve?" Arthur looked at Tiffany with cold, discerning eyes. "The child will be provided for. I have set up a separate educational trust. He will go to college. He will have health care." Arthur paused, his gaze hardening. "But the child will not inherit the estate, and neither will the mother. You wanted the mansion, Ms. Miller? You backed the wrong horse." Tiffany's face crumpled. She looked at Richard with sudden, sharp revulsion. "You told me it was a done deal," she hissed. "You said he was senile." "He is incompetent," Richard yelled. "I'll sue. I'll drag this family through every court in Connecticut." "You can try," Sarah spoke. Her voice was soft, but it stopped the room cold. Sarah stepped away from the wheelchair. She walked around the desk and stood next to the lawyer. She placed her hand on the blue folder. The leather felt cool under her fingertips. "You can sue, Richard," Sarah said, looking him in the eye. "But Mr. Henderson is the best estate lawyer on the East Coast. And you are currently unemployed, aren't you? Since the board found out about the embezzlement rumors last month?" Richard went pale. "How do you know about that?" "I pay the bills, Richard," Sarah said. "I see the legal fees. I see the hush money. I know everything." She took a deep breath, feeling a strange new sensation in her chest. It wasn't happiness, it was power. "The house is mine," Sarah said. "The trust is mine." She looked at Tiffany. "And the dinner is over." Richard stared at Sarah as if he were seeing a stranger. The quiet, submissive woman who had worn navy suits and apologized for existing for 10 years had vanished. In her place stood a woman in a red dress who held the deed to his life in her hands. "You can't be serious," Richard snarled, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "You're going to kick me out? Tonight? This is my father's house." "It was," Sarah corrected him, her voice calm but cutting. "Now it is my house, and I don't want you in it." "Where am I supposed to go?" Richard demanded, stepping forward aggressively. "I have no cash, my cards are frozen, and I have a pregnant fiancée to think about." "That's not my concern," Sarah said, her eyes cold. "Go to a hotel. Go to your club, although I believe the membership is billed to the estate, so I'll be cancelling that first thing tomorrow morning. Just go." "You bitch!" Richard lunged across the rug, his hands curled into fists. Mr. Henderson stepped forward to intervene, but he didn't need to. Arthur had already pressed the silent alarm on his wheelchair armrest. The heavy library door swung open instantly, and 2 large men in black suits entered. These weren't the catering staff. They were private security, ex-military, hired to protect the jewels at the party. Now, they were there to protect the new owner. "Mr. Blackwood," the lead guard said, nodding respectfully to Arthur. "Is there a problem?" "My son and his guest were just leaving," Arthur said, his voice flat. "Please escort them to their vehicle. Ensure they do not stop to speak to the guests." "No!" Richard shouted, as the guard gripped his arm. "Get your hands off me. I'm Richard Blackwood." "And you have overstayed your welcome," Arthur said. "Goodbye, Richard." Richard shook the guard off violently, straightening his jacket in a pathetic attempt to salvage his dignity. He turned to Sarah, his face twisted with venom. "You think you've won? You think those people out there, the board, the investors, will accept you? They're my friends, Sarah. They're my circle. You'll be alone in this big, empty mausoleum." I'd rather be alone than with a traitor, Sarah replied softly. Richard stormed out, the guards flanking him closely. Tiffany hesitated in the center of the room. She looked at Sarah, then down at the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her own wrist, a gift Richard had bought with family money. She looked terrified that Sarah would demand it back. "Keep the jewelry, Tiffany," Sarah said, reading her mind. "Consider it a severance package. You're going to need it." Tiffany flushed a deep crimson, gathered the train of her ridiculous white gown, and scurried after Richard. When the doors closed, the silence in the library was heavy. Sarah's adrenaline crashed, her knees buckled, and she sank into the leather chair opposite the desk. "I can't believe I did that," she whispered, her hands shaking. "It was the only right thing to do," Arthur said gently. "But Sarah, the hard part isn't over." Sarah looked up. "What do you mean?" "Richard is right about one thing," Arthur warned, his eyes serious. "The wolves are outside, the guests, the press, the board members. They are waiting for a speech. They are waiting for the heir. If you stay in here, they will think you are hiding. They will think Richard is right, that you are weak." Arthur leaned forward. "You have to go out there. You have to finish the party. You are the Lady of Blackwood Manor now. You don't bow to them. They bow to you." Sarah felt a wave of nausea. "I can't face them. They all saw how he treated me. They've been laughing at me all night." "Then give them a reason to stop laughing," Arthur said. "Go. Walk him out. Make sure everyone knows who holds the keys." Sarah closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of old paper and victory. She stood up and smoothed the silk of her red dress. "Okay," she said. Sarah walked out of the library and into the corridor that overlooked the grand hall. The atmosphere in the party had shifted. The music had stopped. The guests were clustered in tight groups, whispering frantically. The sight of the security guards escorting the host's son toward the door had caused a ripple of panic. Richard was near the front entrance, struggling against the guards' pace. He pushed the heavy doors open, letting the humid night air rush in. Before he stepped out, he turned back to the crowd of stunned socialites. "Ask her!" Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger back toward the top of the stairs, toward Sarah. "Ask the new owner why she's throwing her husband onto the street." He disappeared into the night, Tiffany stumbling behind him. The heavy door slammed shut with a final, booming thud. 100 pairs of eyes turned upward. They locked onto Sarah. Mr. Sterling, the chairman of the board, stepped forward. He looked confused. "Mrs. Blackwood, what did he mean? Where is he going?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the faces, the same faces that had smirked when Tiffany handed her the bag, the same faces that had ignored her for a decade. She descended the stairs slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't look down. "My husband has taken ill," Sarah lied. It was a smooth, polite social lie, the kind these people understood perfectly. "And Miss Miller has kindly offered to escort him to a place where he can recover." She stopped in the exact center of the room. "As for the announcement," Sarah continued, her voice projecting to the back of the room, strong and unwavering. "Arthur has decided to make a change in the management of the estate. Effective immediately, all matters regarding the Blackwood Trust will be directed to me." She paused, looking Mr. Sterling in the eye. "I am the new chair," she stated. Mr. Sterling's mouth opened slightly. He looked at the closed door, then back at the woman in the red dress. He was a businessman. He knew a hostile takeover when he saw one, and he knew who was left standing. Slowly, Mr. Sterling raised his champagne glass. "To Mrs. Blackwood," he said. The room hesitated for a heartbeat, and then the chorus joined in. "To Mrs. Blackwood." Sarah nodded her head in acknowledgement. She turned to leave, but a waiter appeared with a silver tray. "Madame," the waiter said, "your drink?" It was a vodka martini, extra dry. The drink Tiffany had ordered earlier to mock her. Sarah looked at the glass. She picked it up, the condensation cool against her fingers. She looked at the door where her husband and his mistress had vanished into the dark. "No," Sarah said. She placed the glass back on the tray with a sharp clink. "Take that away. I prefer champagne." She signaled the band to play, and as the music swelled, Sarah Blackwood smiled. She had survived the night. The war was won. 6 months later, the Blackwood estate was unrecognizable. The gloomy, oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the mansion for decades had lifted. The heavy velvet drapes were pulled back, letting sunlight flood the grand hall. The overgrown rose garden, once a tangle of thorns, was now in full bloom, vibrant reds and soft pinks that Sarah tended to herself on weekends. Sarah sat on the stone patio, sipping her morning tea. She wasn't wearing the navy suit nor the red dress. She wore jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking younger and lighter than she had in years. Across from her sat Mr. Henderson. "The divorce is finalized, Sarah," he said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the patio table. He contested the prenup, of course. Tried to argue emotional distress. The judge threw it out in less than 10 minutes. Sarah picked up the paper. It was just a signature, but it felt like freedom. And the trust? Secure. Richard has exhausted his liquid assets on legal fees. And, well, you heard about Ms. Miller? Sarah took a sip of tea. "I heard rumors." "She left him last week," Henderson confirmed, a dry smile touching his lips. "Apparently, the Blackwood lifestyle is less appealing when it involves a rented one-bedroom apartment in New Haven and a mountain of debt. She's moved on to a hedge fund manager in New York." Sarah didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel pity, either. She just felt a quiet sense of closure. Richard had chased a mirage and lost the oasis he was standing in. "There is one more thing," Henderson said, looking toward the driveway. "He's at the gate." Sarah set her cup down. "Let him in, but don't open the front door. I'll meet him on the drive." She walked down the gravel path. Richard was standing on the other side of the wrought-iron gates. He looked terrible. His suit was ill-fitting, his face puffy, his eyes darting around nervously. He looked at the house, his house, in his mind, and then at Sarah. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking. He tried to smile, that same greasy charm, but it was rusted through. "You look good. The garden looks nice." "What do you want, Richard?" Sarah asked, stopping 5 feet from the gate. She didn't unlock it. I wanted to talk. About Dad." Richard shifted his weight. Arthur had passed away peacefully 2 months prior, sitting in his favorite spot in the solarium. I barely got to say goodbye. "You had 40 years to say hello, Richard. You didn't bother until you wanted his money," Sarah said calm. "Look, I made mistakes," Richard pleaded, gripping the iron bars. "Tiffany, she was a mistake. I was confused. But we were good once, right? You and me? Sarah, I'm drowning. The legal fees, the loans. If you could just advance me a little from the trust, just until I get back on my feet. For old times' sake." Sarah looked at the man she had wasted 10 years on. She saw the selfishness etched into every line of his face. He didn't miss her. He missed the ATM. "The trust is for the family, Richard," Sarah said. "I am family," he shouted, his desperation breaking through. "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "You're a trespasser." She turned around. Sarah, wait! You can't leave me like this!" Richard screamed, shaking the gates. "I'm a Blackwood." Sarah didn't look back. She walked up the driveway, past the blooming roses, toward the house that finally, truly, felt like home. She walked through the front door and closed it, locking the world and Richard out. The silence in the hall wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. And that is how Sarah Blackwood went from the invisible wife to the owner of the Out Empire. Richard thought he held all the cards because he had the bloodline, but he forgot the most important rule of legacy. It's not about who you are born to, but who you are loyal to. Arthur Blackwood saw the truth, that the person who kept him warm in the freezing basement was the only real family he had left. Richard lost everything: his wife, his mistress, his inheritance, and his pride. In the end, the mansion wasn't a prize for the greedy. It was a sanctuary for the good. What do you think? Did Arthur make the right choice, giving everything to Sarah? Or should blood always come first, regardless of behavior? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.